Welcome. Tonight's story begins with a simple transaction that would spiral into terror, silence, and unanswered questions. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value stories built on deep research, real historical patterns, and careful fact-checking. Please subscribe. Each video requires extensive work uncovering truth from fragmented and often hidden records. Now, let's step into a night when a woman purchased as a caretaker would be remembered not for her role, but for the fear that followed and the history that could never be undone. She was not bought to labor in the fields. She was purchased for trust, to care for a child inside a white household. On paper, it sounded almost humane. In reality, it placed an enslaved woman into the most dangerous space imaginable, the private heart of a family, where power was absolute and accountability non-existent. Caretakers were expected to be invisible yet indispensable. They slept lightly, listened constantly, and carried the weight of lives that were never truly theirs to protect. Any mistake, any accusation, any shift in mood could mean punishment, sale, or death. And yet, something happened on this particular night, something so severe that whispers survived long after official records fell silent. What exactly occurred is tangled in fear, rumor, and erased testimony. A child harmed, a household shaken, a woman transformed from caretaker to threat. Was it an act of resistance, a desperate response to abuse, or a crime magnified by racial terror? History rarely offers clear answers when the accused had no voice. What we do know is this: by morning, the household was no longer the same. Authorities responded swiftly. Explanations were shaped to protect power, and the enslaved woman at the center of it all was remembered not as a human being, but as a warning. This story is not just about one night. It is about how slavery turned care into coercion, trust into surveillance, and survival into something that could be labeled terror by those who held the pen. Listen closely, because what's missing from this story may be just as important as what remains. In the antebellum United States, enslaved women were commonly assigned roles within white households as domestic caretakers, including nurses, nannies, and personal attendants. These positions were often portrayed by slaveholders as signs of trust or kindness, but in reality they reflected calculated control. Enslaved women were chosen not for compassion, but for perceived obedience, physical endurance, and the belief that they could be closely monitored within the home. Caretaking roles placed enslaved women in constant proximity to white families, especially children. They were responsible for feeding, bathing, supervising, and soothing infants and young children, often around the clock. Despite this intimate labor, they held no legal authority or protection. Any injury, illness, or misfortune involving a child could be blamed on the caretaker, regardless of circumstances. These roles were especially dangerous because they existed in private spaces where abuse was rarely witnessed or recorded. Enslaved women could be subjected to extreme physical exhaustion, emotional strain, and sexual violence, with no ability to refuse or report mistreatment. The same closeness that allowed them to care for children also exposed them to constant scrutiny and suspicion. Slaveholding families frequently relied on caretakers while denying them humanity. Enslaved women were expected to display endless patience, affection, and loyalty, even though their own children might be sold away or neglected due to labor demands. This contradiction created deep psychological trauma, forcing women to nurture children who legally belonged to those who owned them. When tragedy occurred, enslaved caretakers were often cast as villains rather than victims. Accusations against them were shaped by racial fear and the assumption of inherent danger. Understanding the role of enslaved women as caretakers reveals how slavery weaponized care itself, turning acts of nurturing into sites of coercion, risk, and historical silence. In slaveholding households of the 19th century United States, trust was never freely given to enslaved people. It was enforced and conditional. When enslaved women were assigned to work inside the home, especially in roles involving children, slaveholders often claimed these women were trusted. In reality, this so-called trust existed alongside constant surveillance. The household was a controlled environment where every movement, interaction, and mistake could be observed and judged. Domestic spaces allowed slaveholders to monitor enslaved women more closely than field labor did. Kitchens, nurseries, and bedrooms were areas where white family members moved freely, creating continuous oversight. Enslaved caretakers were rarely alone, and when they were, that absence itself could provoke suspicion. Surveillance functioned not just through physical presence, but through rules, routines, and fear of punishment. This environment blurred the line between intimacy and control. Enslaved women were expected to demonstrate affection, loyalty, and attentiveness while knowing they were always being watched. Any perceived emotional distance, fatigue, or frustration could be interpreted as neglect or hostility. Trust, in this context, meant absolute compliance under observation, not mutual respect. Surveillance was also enforced through other enslaved people. House slaves were often pressured to report on one another's behavior, creating internal monitoring systems that further stripped individuals of privacy and solidarity. This constant scrutiny heightened stress and reduced opportunities for resistance or rest. The combination of claimed trust and relentless surveillance created a dangerous contradiction. Enslaved caretakers bore immense responsibility without authority, and suspicion never disappeared, no matter how well they performed their duties. This imbalance ensured that when something went wrong, blame could be swiftly assigned, often reinforcing racial fears and justifying severe punishment within a system designed to protect slaveholders above all else. Private spaces within slaveholding homes were among the most dangerous environments for enslaved women. Unlike fields or public work areas, households operated beyond outside scrutiny. What happened in bedrooms, nurseries, and kitchens was largely invisible to neighbors, authorities, and courts. This isolation left enslaved women extremely vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, and false accusation. Enslaved women working inside the home were subject to the unchecked authority of white family members, particularly male heads of household. Sexual violence was widespread and rarely documented, as the law did not recognize enslaved women as victims of assault. Resistance or refusal could result in punishment, sale, or retaliation disguised as discipline. Silence was often the only means of survival. Even routine caregiving tasks carried risk. If a child became ill, cried excessively, or was injured, the enslaved caretaker could be blamed regardless of cause. In an environment shaped by racial fear, normal human error was often interpreted as negligence or malice. Enslaved women bore responsibility without protection, authority, or the ability to defend themselves. These private spaces also erased witnesses. Other enslaved people might be excluded from certain rooms, and white women in the household were often complicit or powerless within patriarchal structures themselves. As a result, abuse and coercion could continue unchallenged for years, leaving no formal record behind. Understanding this vulnerability is essential to interpreting historical accusations and incidents involving enslaved women. Private spaces magnified power imbalances and removed accountability, allowing harm to occur while preserving the public image of respectability. What survived in records often reflects fear and control, not the lived reality of the women who endured these hidden spaces. In slaveholding households of the 19th century United States, power dynamics between enslavers and caretakers were absolute and one-sided. Enslavers exercised total legal and social authority, reinforced by laws that defined enslaved people as property. Caretakers, despite their critical responsibilities, had no recognized rights, no legal protections, and no ability to negotiate the conditions of their labor. This imbalance shaped every interaction within the home. Caretakers were entrusted with intimate tasks, feeding children, tending to illness, managing daily routines, yet this responsibility never translated into authority. Decisions about a child's care ultimately belonged to the enslaver, and any outcome deemed unsatisfactory could result in punishment. Success was expected and invisible. Failure, real or perceived, was harshly punished. This created a constant state of fear and compliance. Gender intensified these power dynamics. Male enslavers held dominance over both enslaved women and white women within the household. Enslaved caretakers were especially vulnerable to sexual exploitation, coercion, and intimidation. The law offered no recognition of consent for enslaved women, allowing abuse to occur without consequence while preserving the enslaver's public respectability. White women in the household often occupied an ambiguous role. While they might rely heavily on enslaved caretakers, they also benefited from the system and could exercise authority over them. Jealousy, suspicion, or resentment could easily be translated into punishment or accusation, further destabilizing the caretaker's position. These power dynamics ensured that caretakers lived under constant pressure. Their labor sustained the household, yet their lives were disposable. Understanding this imbalance is critical to interpreting historical incidents involving enslaved caretakers, as actions and outcomes were shaped not by equality or justice, but by a system designed to preserve control at any human cost. Child care under slavery in the 19th century United States was shaped by contradiction and cruelty. Enslaved women were often made responsible for the care of white children, while being denied control over their own families. Slaveholders relied heavily on enslaved caretakers to feed, bathe, comfort, and supervise their children, sometimes from infancy through adolescence. Yet this reliance did not translate into respect or protection. Enslaved caretakers were expected to show constant attentiveness and emotional warmth, even as they worked long hours with little rest. Any sign of fatigue, frustration, or illness could be interpreted as neglect. If a child cried excessively, fell ill, or suffered an injury, blame was frequently placed on the enslaved woman, regardless of circumstances. The standard imposed on them was impossibly high and unforgiving. At the same time, enslaved women were often separated from their own children or forced to leave them unattended to fulfill childcare duties for white families. This created profound emotional trauma. Mothers were made to nurture children who legally belonged to those who owned them, while their own children could be sold away at any moment. This imbalance reflected how slavery weaponized maternal labor for the benefit of enslavers. Childcare also functioned as a form of control. By placing enslaved women in close contact with white children, slaveholders believed they could shape loyalty and obedience while maintaining constant oversight. Yet this proximity also fueled racial fear and suspicion, particularly when children became ill or harmed. Caretakers were easily transformed from trusted servants into perceived threats. Understanding childcare under slavery reveals how deeply the system distorted basic human relationships. Acts of care were stripped of dignity and turned into obligations enforced by fear. Enslaved women were denied the right to protect their own families while being held responsible for the lives of others, a burden that exposed them to constant risk, accusation, and punishment. In 19th century America, especially in slaveholding states, fear-driven narratives about enslaved people were widespread and deeply ingrained. White society promoted the idea that enslaved individuals, particularly women and men in close proximity to white families, posed a constant threat. These beliefs were not based on evidence, but on racial stereotypes designed to justify control, surveillance, and violence. Racial panic often intensified when incidents occurred inside the home. If a child fell ill, was injured, or died, suspicion quickly turned toward enslaved caretakers. Rather than considering illness, accidents, or medical limitations of the time, slaveholders and communities frequently assumed malicious intent. Fear replaced reason, and rumor spread faster than facts. Newspapers, court records, and oral accounts often amplified these fears. Enslaved women accused of wrongdoing were portrayed as dangerous, deceptive, or unnatural, reinforcing racist myths that depicted them as incapable of genuine care. These narratives erased context, ignored coercion, and removed any possibility of understanding events from the enslaved person's perspective. Racial panic also served a political and social purpose. By framing enslaved people as threats, slaveholding society justified harsher controls, increased punishment, and stricter surveillance. Fear was used as a tool to reinforce dominance and discourage empathy, ensuring that sympathy remained with slaveholders rather than victims of the system. These fear-driven narratives continue to shape how such events are remembered. They explain why some enslaved women were remembered as symbols of terror rather than as individuals trapped in impossible circumstances. Understanding racial panic helps separate historical truth from propaganda and reveals how fear was deliberately manufactured to sustain an unjust system. The historical record of slavery in the United States is marked by a profound absence of enslaved voices. Enslaved people were generally prohibited from testifying against white individuals in court, and in many states their testimony was not legally recognized at all. This meant that when incidents occurred involving violence, accusation, or death, The perspectives of enslaved individuals were excluded by law from official proceedings. Most surviving documents from the antebellum period were created by slaveholders, judges, doctors, ministers, or newspaper editors, nearly all of them white men. As a result, events were recorded through the lens of power. Enslaved women accused of wrongdoing were described, judged, and condemned without ever being allowed to explain their actions, circumstances, or suffering in their own words. This absence was especially damaging in cases involving domestic labor and caregiving. When something went wrong inside a household, records often present only the conclusions of owners or authorities, shaped by fear and racial bias. Enslaved caretakers were reduced to caricatures, dangerous, negligent, or monstrous, while the coercive conditions under which they lived were ignored. Illiteracy enforced by law further deepened this silence. Teaching enslaved people to read or write was discouraged or criminalized in many southern states. Personal letters, diaries, or written defenses from enslaved individuals are therefore extremely rare. Their experiences survived mostly through fragments, second-hand accounts, plantation inventories, punishment logs, or oral histories passed down generations later. The absence of enslaved testimony does not indicate a lack of perspective. It reveals systematic erasure. To understand these stories responsibly, historians must read records critically, recognizing that silence was imposed, not chosen. What is missing from the archives is often the clearest evidence of injustice, reminding us that history was written by those who held power, not by those who endured it. Violence within slaveholding households was often hidden from public view, occurring behind closed doors where there were no witnesses and no accountability. Domestic spaces such as kitchens, bedrooms, and back rooms allowed enslavers to punish enslaved people privately, away from neighbors or authorities. This secrecy made violence routine and difficult to challenge, especially when victims were enslaved women working inside the home. Punishment did not always require proof of wrongdoing. Accusations alone, often driven by fear, suspicion, or anger, were enough to justify beatings, confinement, or deprivation of food and sleep. Enslaved caretakers were particularly vulnerable because their work involved constant interaction with children and intimate household spaces. Any perceived mistake could trigger swift and severe punishment. The law rarely intervened in these cases. Slaveholders were largely protected from prosecution unless violence resulted in death or financial loss to another owner. Even then, investigations were often superficial. Courts and local officials tended to accept the word of enslavers over any evidence suggesting abuse, reinforcing a system where violence was normalized rather than condemned. This private violence also served as a warning to others. Punishment behind closed doors reinforced obedience through fear, ensuring that enslaved people understood the consequences of resistance or perceived failure. The lack of witnesses made denial easy and allowed enslavers to maintain a public image of respectability while committing acts of cruelty in private. Understanding this hidden violence is essential to interpreting historical incidents involving enslaved caretakers. What appears in records as sudden outbursts or isolated punishments were often part of a broader pattern of control and intimidation. Behind the silence of official documents lies a reality shaped by fear, suffering, and unchecked power. In the slaveholding United States, any form of resistance by enslaved people was routinely labeled as criminal behavior rather than understood as a response to oppression. Acts that might otherwise be seen as self-defense, survival, or desperation were reframed as threats to public order. Enslaved women, in particular, were denied recognition as moral or rational actors. When they resisted, their actions were often portrayed as dangerous or unnatural. The legal system played a central role in this criminalization. Laws were designed to protect property and maintain control, not to assess motive or context. Enslaved individuals accused of wrongdoing faced swift punishment with little to no due process. Courts rarely considered the conditions of abuse, coercion, or fear that shaped their actions. Resistance itself was treated as proof of guilt. Gender and race intensified this dynamic. Enslaved women who resisted were often depicted as especially frightening, violating both racial hierarchies and gender expectations. Rather than being seen as victims of exploitation, they were cast as villains whose actions justified harsh retaliation. This narrative erased the reality of constant threat under which they lived. Punishment served not only to discipline individuals, but to send a message. By criminalizing resistance, slaveholding society reinforced obedience and discouraged others from defying authority. Public executions, imprisonments, or severe corporal punishment were meant to instill fear and maintain control across the enslaved population. Understanding the criminalization of resistance is essential to reading historical records accurately. What appears as crime in the archives often reflects acts of survival within an inescapable system. Recognizing this distortion allows us to separate imposed labels from lived reality and to see resistance not as evil, but as a human response to extreme injustice. In the 19th century United States, especially within slaveholding communities, rumors often carried more weight than documented facts when enslaved people were involved. Formal investigations were rare, and when they did occur, they were shaped by racial bias and the desire to protect white families' reputations. In the absence of fair legal processes, gossip and speculation filled the gaps, quickly becoming accepted truth. This was particularly evident in cases that occurred inside the home. Events involving illness, injury, or death were frequently explained through whispered accusations rather than evidence. Enslaved caretakers, already viewed through a lens of suspicion, became easy targets. A single allegation could spread rapidly through a community, reinforced by fear-driven assumptions about race and danger. Newspapers and local accounts often repeated these rumors without verification. Language was sensationalized, framing enslaved women as threats or monsters while omitting context, motive, or coercion. Once printed or retold, these stories hardened into record, even when no trial, confession, or proof existed. The written word, though biased, outlived the people it misrepresented. Rumors also served a social function. They protected powerful families from scrutiny by shifting blame downward. Rather than questioning household conditions, medical practices, or abuse, communities accepted narratives that preserved the existing hierarchy. Truth became less important than stability and control. Over time, these rumor-based accounts replaced reality in historical memory. With enslaved voices excluded from records, there was little to challenge false narratives. Understanding how rumors substituted for documented truth reminds us to approach such stories critically, recognizing that what survived in history often reflects fear and power, not objective reality. The legacy of slavery is shaped not only by what was recorded, but by what was deliberately left out. When enslaved people's voices were erased from official records, what remained were stories filtered through fear, accusation, and power. Over time, these distorted accounts hardened into collective memory, where terror was remembered but humanity was not. Enslaved individuals became symbols in cautionary tales rather than people with lived experiences. This imbalance has long-term consequences for how history is understood. Incidents involving enslaved caretakers or domestic laborers were often remembered as moments of danger or betrayal, while the conditions that produced those moments were ignored. The absence of first-person testimony meant that suffering, coercion, and abuse remained invisible, allowing one-sided narratives to dominate public memory. For descendants of the enslaved, this erasure created deep gaps in family history. Names, relationships, and personal stories were lost or replaced with labels imposed by others. Trauma was passed down without context, while the individuals who endured it were denied recognition. Remembered terror replaced remembered lives. For broader society, these silences shaped myths about slavery that persisted long after its end. By focusing on fear rather than injustice, communities avoided confronting responsibility. Stories were simplified into warnings instead of lessons, reinforcing racial stereotypes rather than challenging them. Re-examining these erased voices is essential to restoring historical truth. When we look beyond remembered terror and ask who was silenced, we begin to see the full human cost of slavery. Acknowledging these gaps is not about rewriting history. It is about finally listening to those who were never allowed to speak.